Night laid itself over the old kingdom like a heavy velvet cloak, muting the edges of things, softening stone and thorn and bone. The castle at its centre had forgotten how to glow with life. Its windows were blind, its courtyards hushed, its towers standing like the ribs of some enormous sleeping beast against the sky. Ivy clung to the walls, thick as old secrets, and the great gate hung half open as if frozen mid-sigh. Around it, the forest had crept closer over the decades, then the years, then the lifetimes. Roots had pushed up through cobblestones, saplings had grown into trees tall enough to peer over the battlements. Birds nested in the rafters of the great hall. Foxes denned beneath the once polished staircases. Time, given enough patience, had remade the place in its own image. At the heart of it all, where sunlight no longer came and moonlight rarely lingered, on a bed that had once been embroidered by hands long turned to dust, a woman slept. She had slept for so long that the story of her sleep had grown wrinkled and strange, changed every time it passed through another mouth. Some said she was a princess cursed by a slighted fairy. Some said she was a witch who sealed herself away in penance or defiance. Some said she was a saint, some a punishment, some a prize. The truth, as is often the case, lay somewhere crooked between. Her name had been Aurora once, though she had lived most of her remembered life being called by softer names. Little one, child, girl, pretty thing, promise. Names that glossed over the sharp corners of her thoughts. The places where something inside her wanted more than she was allowed to say. Her hair was the colour of wheat just before harvest, her skin the pale of dawn before the sun commits itself to the sky. In the stories, they lingered on those details as if they mattered most. They did not speak about how, even as a child, she had walked too far into the gardens, drawn to the dark edges where roses grew wild without the gardener's tidy hand. They left out the way she had listened at keyholes, the way she had practiced saying no in her head because there were so few chances to say it aloud. They never spoke about the dreams that came before the sleep. The curse, when it fell, was almost a relief. It came with blood, as old curses often do, a prick of a spindle hidden in an unused tower. The sting bright and oddly intimate. The world tilted, the colours folded inward. A pain like a thread pulled too tight, then snapped, then falling, but without impact. The sense, as she tumbled inward, that the floor had dropped away, and yet she remained suspended in a space between. The kingdom slept with her. Servants slumped where they stood. Doves grew still on their perches. A cook's hand froze halfway through stirring a pot. Horses lowered their heads to imaginary water and did not lift them again. The king and queen, whose love was a complicated thing of pride and possession and genuine fear, bowed under the weight of the spell without ever knowing it had finally found them. Outside the castle walls, the wave of magic faltered, then spent itself. The village nearest the forest woke the next morning to a distant silence where there should have been bells. Smoke no longer curled from the castle chimneys. The road grew strange without footsteps to mark it. People talked, at first, they speculated, they feared, they invented explanations grand enough to account for their unease. They said the royal family had offended a fairy, that a wicked witch had claimed the castle, that the place had been swallowed whole by the earth. Then other worries came. Crops failed, children were born, plagues visited, new rulers rose in other cities. War threatened on distant borders. The world had its own business to attend to, and the castle at the forest's heart became less a concern and more a convenient story to tell when the nights grew too still. In the castle, there was no such distraction. There was only sleep. Aurora did not die. The curse was not merciful enough for that. Her body lay on the bed, unchanged by time, chest rising and falling with the slow regularity of winter waves. Dust settled, but not on her. Spiders spun webs in the corners, but not across her face. The forest pressed its roots around the foundations and found no way in. Inside her, in the place where most people's dreams cooled and dissipated by morning, something different happened. At first, it was a single room she wandered, a memory of her chamber, but larger, with windows that looked out on nothing she recognized. The furniture was wrong, the walls a color no one had ever painted, but it felt familiar in a way that bypassed sight and sank straight into bone. Then there were corridors, doors that opened into gardens that could never have fitted inside the castle, a staircase that went down, down, into a library where the shelves were filled not with books but with murmuring jars of light. The dreams were not like the fevered flickerings she'd known before the curse. They were slow, a world of their own, made of thought and memory and something older than both. If you sleep long enough, your dreams acquire weather. Seasons move through that inner kingdom, not always in the order the outer world assumed. Once, for an eternity that might have been a week, thick snow fell silently in every room she entered, melting the moment it touched her skin. Once, there was a summer that burned only at the edges of things, leaving the center cool and untouched. She grew used to walking barefoot along paths no one else had trod, to hearing her own footsteps echo in hallways lined with portraits whose faces were always turned away. She grew used to the company of shadows that shifted just out of sight, to a voice sometimes singing from another room in a language that tasted like rain and smoke. She knew dimly, somewhere beyond all of that her body lay unmoving in a bed she could no longer see. She felt the steady tide of breath, the slow drum of her heart. They were the only measures of time she had left. Outside, the forest grew teeth. Not the kind the villagers feared, wolves, boars, marauding bandits, but green teeth, thorns and brambles, nettles and briars. They twisted around the castle walls, wove themselves between gate bars, grew so thick that no one could approach without being turned back, cut, or lost. The old people in the village said it was protection. The younger ones said it was proof the place was cursed. Either way, no one went near any more. The castle was surrendered to the stories and the trees. Until he came. He had not been born when the kingdom slept. His grandfather had heard the tale from his grandmother, who had heard it from a peddler passing through. By the time it reached his ears, it had been trimmed and embroidered and trussed up in moral lessons like a festival goose. Don't anger those who grant favors. Don't stray from the path. Don't wish for more than you're given. He liked the parts between the warnings best, the hints of something older, a forest that refused entry, a girl who slept and did not age, a curse that did not kill but did not relent. He grew up in another city, where the stone streets were always busy and the nights never entirely dark. He learned to fight because that was what boys of his house did. He learned to smile a certain way, to say certain words with just enough sincerity that people believed him. He learnt to wear a sword and a title like another kind of armor. He also learned how to slip away. On the nights when the court's rooms felt too hot, too loud, when the eyes on him were too many and too sharp, he walked. Out beyond the lamps, beyond the walls, into the thin ring of trees that had been left as a nod to what the land had been before. He listened to the leaves, to the small creatures moving, to the wind that carried news no human tongues bothered with. He never went as far as the deep forest, not then. But it sat at the edge of his awareness like a door he knew he would open one day. When he was old enough to have taken a wife and produced the next generation of duty, he had not. When he was old enough to have commanded a small army in some pointless border skirmish, he hadn't. He had fought when required, smiled when needed, done the things that kept the gears of his family's expectations turning. But something in him had held back, as if waiting for a story that was not yet being told. He heard the tale of the sleeping castle again at 28 from an old woman in the market whose hands shook as she weighed out herbs. This time, there was a detail he'd not heard before. The thorns that bled if you cut them, the way birds went quiet when they flew too near. "It's a bad place," she said, her eyes milky but fixed on his face with unnerving clarity. "Best leave such things to rot into the ground." He thanked her, paid too much for the herbs, and went home with the prickling sense that the world had just drawn a small circle on the map of his life and labelled it later. Later came when he could no longer pretend he believed in the path set before him, the talk of negotiations, of alliances forged with marriages, of land gained and land lost. All of it tasted like ash. He did his part, but each year, something inside him grew quieter, then louder, then too insistent to ignore. One night, after a banquet where a visiting lord had spoken with glee of a village burned for its disobedience, he went back to his chambers, took off the heavy cloak, the fine rings, the gilded sword. He looked at himself in the mirror, the face of a man everyone thought they knew. The face of a man who had not yet chosen anything that mattered for himself. He packed a small satchel. Bread, a knife, a coil of rope, a few coins, the herbs he'd bought years before, still potent enough, tied in their little bundles. He took a plain sword, not the ceremonial one. He wrote a note that did not explain much and left it where someone he trusted would find it. Then he left, not through the main gate with its expectations and ceremonies, but through a side door that servants used to carry out the rubbish. It felt appropriate. The road to the Old Kingdom was longer than the tale suggested. It took him through towns where no one had heard of a sleeping castle, through fields where new rulers' flags snapped in the wind. He slept in barns and under hedges, in inns where he kept his head down and his back to the wall. He asked a few questions carefully. Many people shrugged. Some crossed themselves. A few, the oldest ones, nodded slowly and pointed always in the same direction, toward the forest that had no name anymore, only a reputation. "It'll turn you around," one man said, his voice thick with ale and something less easily named. "You'll walk and end up where you started, only more tired." "Then I'll be good at something I'm already practiced in," the traveller replied calmly, and the man had no answer for that. By the time he reached the forest's edge, the soles of his boots were worn thin, and his shoulders had lost the memory of velvet cloaks. He stood at the line, where cultivated land gave way to wild growth, and felt something in him loosen, then coil. The trees here were older than the ones near his city, their trunks wide and scarred. Moss grew in thick ruffs along their roots. Beneath the canopy, the air was cooler, heavy with the scent of damp leaf and loam. Birdsong dripped through the branches in careful notes. He stepped forward. The first days in the forest were uneventful in the way that unsettles those who expect constant danger. Nothing attacked him. No path opened miraculously to guide him. He walked. He listened. He noticed how the light changed with the hours, how the undergrowth shifted from ferns to brambles to soft moss depending on where he laid his feet. Time stretched. He slept when he was tired. He drank from streams that ran clear and cold. He ate sparingly. He did not speak aloud much, because there was no one to answer, but he found words forming in his mind anyway, addressed to someone he did not quite yet have a name for. On the fourth night, he woke to the feeling of being watched. He lay still, hand on the knife that rested under the edge of his cloak, and listened. The forest was not silent, it never was. But the sounds had changed. The usual rustle of small creatures, the sigh of leaves, the occasional distant call of an owl. They were still there, but behind them, another kind of quiet pressed. "Are you going to pretend to be asleep much longer?" The voice came from his left, deep and threaded with something rough, like bark under the hand. It was not human, but it carried humor, or something akin to it. He rolled slowly onto his side. The wolf sat just beyond the dim circle of firelight, its fur a dark blend of night and shadow, its eyes catching the glow and throwing it back in pale gold. It was larger than any of the wolves he had heard told of in children's cautionary tales, bigger than a hunting hound, its shoulders level with his chest where he lay. "I was seeing whether I was dreaming," he said. His own voice sounded hoarse in his ears. "You're not," the wolf replied. "If you were, you'd have cut a more impressive figure." The man huffed a short, startled laugh. "You know me, then?" "I know your kind," the wolf said. "You walk into our mouths and then blame us for being hungry." He slowly sat up, keeping his movements unhurried. The fire was mostly embers now. A faint red glow cracked through with black. The forest beyond it was a wall of dark. "I'm not here to blame anything," he said, "or to be eaten, if it can be avoided." "Everything is eaten eventually," the wolf said, unconcerned. "By teeth, by fire, by time. The question is, what you offer in the meantime." He watched the creature carefully. The wolf's posture was relaxed, tail resting, ears forward. There was no immediate threat in it, but there was power coiled under its hide, the sense of something that could move faster than thought if it wished. "I'm looking for the castle," he said. "The one that sleeps." The wolf's eyes narrowed. "Of course you are," it said. "Humans only come this far for one of three reasons: to escape something, to prove something, or to break something." "And which do you think I'm here for?" he asked. The wolf considered him, head tilting. "You do not smell of conquest," it said. "There is fear, but not the sharp smell of immediate danger. More like a fear that has had time to ripen. As for escape," it lifted its nose, sniffed once, twice. "Yes, there is a flavor of that, but it is tangled with something else, curiosity." "I heard a story," he said slowly, "about a woman who slept for 100 years. "More," the wolf said. "Less. These measures become silly after a while." "And the thorns that grew around her," he continued, "and the forest that turned away everyone who tried to find her." "And you thought," the wolf said, "that if you walked far enough, asked the right questions, and looked sincere enough, the forest would make an exception for you." The man's lips twitched. "When you put it like that, it sounds foolish." "It is foolish," the wolf said, "but not the worst kind of foolishness I've seen from your lot." "Is there a way through?" he asked quietly. The wolf's gaze slid away from him into the dark between the trees. "The forest lets in those it chooses," it said, "and keeps out those it doesn't. Thorns are only one way of saying no." "Has anyone been let in?" he pressed. "Not for a long time," the wolf said. "The last one died on the thorns before he reached the gate. He thought bravery meant bleeding in straight lines." "And you watched?" the man asked. "I watch everything," the wolf replied. "It is my curse and my amusement." He swallowed. The fire gave a small sigh as a piece of wood collapsed inward. "If I go on," he said, "will I die on the thorns?" Probably, the wolf said. But you were already dying where you came from, just more slowly. He flinched, not because the words were cruel, but because they were accurate. Why do you care? He asked. What happens to me? To her. The wolf's ears flicked. Care is a human word, it said. I am invested, in the shape of things, in the stories told about this forest. The one they tell now is stale. A girl sleeps, a castle rots, thorns grow. Fear is useful, but boredom is not. So you'd like the story to change, he said. A little, the wolf admitted. He took a breath. The air smelled of ash and damp soil and fur. Will you show me the way? The wolf rose, stretching in a long, fluid motion, claws softly scoring the earth. I will walk where I walk, it said. If you happen to follow, that is your affair. It turned, moving toward the denser dark between the trees, then paused and looked back, eyes catching the ember light. Do not expect the castle to be grateful if you reach it. Sleep changes things. So does being watched by nothing but dust and ghosts for too long. I don't expect gratitude, he said. Only an ending, or a beginning. Sometimes they're the same. The wolf said nothing to that, but its silence did not feel like dismissal. He kicked earth over the embers, shouldered his satchel, and followed. They walked for what might have been hours or days. In the forest, the line between the two blurred. The path was not straight. It doubled back on itself, circled around ancient trees, crossed streams that looked familiar, and yet were not. The undergrowth thickened, then thinned. Thorns began to appear in clusters, then in great ropes, then in walls. The wolf moved through them with the easy, sinuous grace of something that had always known where its body ended and the world began. The man did not. He stumbled, snagged, cursed quietly as sharp points traced thin lines of blood along his skin. Do you want to turn back? The wolf asked once, when he stopped to pull a particularly vindictive bramble from his sleeve. No, he said, though his hand shook. Good, the wolf replied. It would be irritating to have brought you this far, only for you to lose your nerve. The thorns ahead grew denser, taller than a man, their branches woven so tightly that not even light passed between them. He could see no gate, no opening, only a living wall, pulsing faintly with a life of its own. Some of the thorns glistened darkly, as if they had drunk from too many careless hands. The wolf stopped. Here, it said. The man stared. I see no door. Of course not, the wolf replied. You are used to doors being made for you. He stepped closer. The thorns seemed to lean in, sensing opportunity. He could feel their attention, if such a thing could be said of plants. It prickled against his skin. What do I do? He asked. Ask, the wolf said simply. He almost laughed. Ask? Yes, ask. Doors are made of answers. This one has not been asked the right question in a long time. He stood there, breathing slowly, looking at the mass of green and dark and glinting sharpness. Yellowed leaves shivered. Somewhere inside, a bird rustled, trapped in its own bad decision. He could ask for passage, for the thorns to part, for the castle to let him in, for the spell to break. The words that came out of his mouth, when he finally spoke, were not any of those. Let me see her, he said quietly. Let me see what the story has forgotten. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the thorns shuddered. It was not a graceful opening. Branches twisted, scraped, dragged against each other, with a sound like bones under stone. A narrow gap appeared, just wide enough for a man to turn sideways and force his way through. It smelled of green and old blood. He turned to the wolf. Will you come? No, the wolf said. My place is here, at the edge, between leaving and returning. Besides, the castle and I have an understanding. We keep our distance. He nodded, throat dry. If I don't come back? You will, the wolf said. One way or another. Everything returns to the forest eventually. He didn't ask what that meant. There wasn't room in his chest for more possibilities. He stepped into the opening. The thorns did not attack exactly, but they did not make it comfortable. They scraped along his back, his chest, his thighs. One nicked the side of his neck, and he felt warm blood trickle down into his collar. He kept going, teeth gritted, focusing on the strip of space ahead of him. When he stumbled out the other side, it was with the sense of having been born again in a very undignified way. He sucked in a breath that tasted different, less wild, more still. The sky above the castle was grey-blue, the colour of old bruises, and the air held the faint, penetrating smell of stone that had been long without fire. He turned. The castle loomed before him. It had once been magnificent, he could see that. Even half consumed by ivy, even with whole sections fallen away. It held a certain stubborn grandeur. Towers rose at odd angles, some capped with intact roofs, others open to the sky. Balconies jutted like broken teeth. The great front gate was clogged with fallen timber and creepers, but a smaller side door hung crookedly on its hinges, inviting in a sideways, suspicious way. He approached slowly, senses straining. The silence was not empty. It was layered, the weight of footsteps that had stopped mid-stride. The echo of voices cut off mid-sentence. The dust-heavy pause of 10,000 breaths that had never been exhaled. Inside, the air was cooler. His boots left prints in the dust that lay thick on the flagstones. Cobwebs hung in lace curtains across doorways. A long table in what had been the great hall was set for a feast that had never finished. Plates dulled by time, cups tilted, a roast that was now only bone and shadow. The people who had once sat there were slumped in their chairs, the spell preserving their faces in an uncanny approximation of life. Their chests did not rise. Their eyes were closed. They looked less like the dead and more like puppets whose strings had been cut. He felt the hair on his arms rise. I suppose this is the part, he murmured, where I should feel heroic. No voice answered. His own sounded small in the vastness. He climbed stairs where servants slept in corners, feather dusters still clutched in their hands. He stepped over a boy sprawled in a doorway, a tray of sweetmeats overturned beside him. Somewhere, a mouse skittered, bold in the long absence of cats. At the top of the highest tower, beyond a door that stuck before giving way, with a reluctant groan, he found her. She lay on a bed that had once been fit for a coronation night, its canopy now hanging askew, its silk drapes faded. Dust lay thick on every surface except the narrow path from the door to the bed, where nothing had settled, as if even time had stepped carefully. She was not quite how the stories had painted her. Her hair was not a waterfall of impossible perfection, but a tumble of waves spread across the pillow. Some strands caught on her lips, as if she had turned her head just before sleep. Her hands were not folded primly on her chest. One lay beside her, fingers curled slightly, palm open. Her face was not an angel's. It was a woman's, with the faintest suggestion of a line between her brows, as if something had concerned her in the moment before the spell fell. He approached slowly, as one might approach an altar or a cliff edge. She did not look dead. Her chest rose and fell, almost imperceptibly. Up close, he could see the flutter of her pulse at her throat, as delicate as the wing beat of a small bird. Her lashes cast thin shadows on her cheeks. In sleep, she looked younger than he was, though he knew that in the long counting of years, she had outlived entire generations. He sat on the edge of the bed, careful not to jostle her. The mattress dipped slightly under his weight. Her body shifted the barest fraction, acknowledging his presence in the language of gravity. "I've been walking toward you for a long time," he said quietly, "though I only realized it recently." She did not stir. He reached out a hand, then stopped centimeters above her skin, not quite touching. The air between them hummed. He could feel the warmth of her, the faint breeze of each breath. The story said, a kiss, as if that was always the answer, as if all curses could be broken by the same gesture, applied indiscriminately. His mouth twisted. To press his lips to hers, unasked, simply because he'd arrived and found her there, would be an insult dressed as salvation. He had not come this far to enact a violation sanctioned by a story. Instead, he reached for her hand. It lay open on the coverlet, palm up, as if waiting to be filled with something. His fingers brushed hers, light as a question. The world changed, not out there. The room still smelled of old fabric and long-neglected wood. The dust still lay where it lay. The people downstairs still slept their puppet sleep. But inside his skull, inside the space where thought and feeling normally kept to their own tracks, something shifted sideways. He was no longer sitting on the bed. He was standing in a room that was and was not the tower chamber. The bed was there, but empty. The windows were larger, looking out on a landscape that did not match the world he knew, a forest with leaves and colors he had no names for, a sky where stars swam like fish. She stood by the window, her back to him, hair falling down her spine like a spill of muted gold. "I wondered," she said without turning, "how long it would take someone to knock properly." Her voice was lower than he'd imagined, not girlish, with a rough edge that sounded earned. It resonated not only in his ears, but somewhere at the base of his spine. He swallowed. "If this is knocking," he said slowly, "I hate to think what breaking the door down looks like." She laughed, and the sound slid through him, warm and unexpected. "That was the problem with all the others," she said. "They came to conquer the story, not to ask if it wanted changing." He moved closer, aware of his own body in a new way. In the waking world, he was a man sitting on a bed, fingers resting against a sleeping woman's hand. Here he felt lighter, less bound by muscle and bone, still himself, but in a manner akin to how he felt in dreams just before waking. "You've had others," he said, "visitors." She turned then. Her eyes were not the constant blue of stained glass saints, as the tales liked to paint it, but a shifting grey, like sky between weather. They were sharp, aware, the eyes of someone who had had nothing to do for a long time but think. "Not many," she said. "A few, over the years. Men who pushed their way through the first layer of thorns. One woman who reached the gate and told the guards to go back to sleep because she had no interest in their king." A small smile ghosted across her lips. "I liked her." "What happened to them?" he asked. "The forest turned them around," she said, "or the spell did. Hard to tell from here. One got as far as the hallway outside my room, then decided the dust in his throat meant he was dying and ran away." "And you watched them," he said, "like the wolf?" "I watched what I could see," she said. "Sometimes I felt them in the dream, like a pressure against the walls. Their wanting was very loud." "And mine?" he asked. She tilted her head, considering him. "Yours knocked," she said simply. "There's a difference." He stood near enough now to see the faint shadows under her eyes, The curve of her cheek, the way her mouth restlessly softened and sharpened, even in stillness. She looked both younger and older here than on the bed, more present. "How long have you been here?" he asked, gesturing vaguely at the strange room that was inside and outside at once. "A long time," she said. "Time behaves differently in dreams. Out there, it drags. In here, it folds. I've lived and unlived more stories than I can remember, all without moving my body." "Are you alone?" The word tasted heavy. She glanced back toward the window, where the impossible forest shimmered. "Mostly," she said. "There are echoes, parts of myself. Think of it as being a house with many rooms. Some days I sit in the kitchen and talk to the same thought over and over. Some days I walk down to the cellar and listen to old fears creak. Some nights I climb to the roof and watch memories shoot past like falling stars, but physical company." She turned back to him. "That I have lacked." He felt an ache he hadn't expected. "You sound," he said carefully, "very sane for someone who has been dreaming for a century." "You mistake composure for sanity," she replied. "I am complicated. So are you, or you wouldn't be here." He opened his mouth, then closed it. There was no point pretending otherwise. "What do you want from me?" she asked suddenly. The question caught him off balance. "I don't say to save you," she added quickly, a flash of something sharp in her eyes. "I am so tired of being something to be saved, or used, or conquered, or pitied. They pinned all their own fears on me and called it a curse. The spindle was only the match. The tinder was already there." "What tinder?" he asked softly. Her jaw tightened. "Expectation," she said. "Control. The way they smiled when I was quiet and frowned when I asked the wrong questions." She took a breath that seemed to run deeper than her lungs. "I pricked my finger, bled a little, and all their unspoken wishes collapsed on top of me. Sleep, girl. Be beautiful. Be still. Let us decide what your story is." "They slept too," he pointed out. "The whole castle." "Yes," she said. "That was almost the kindest part. If I had been the only one caught, I might have gone mad. At least this way, the world acknowledged something had happened, even if they eventually turned it into entertainment." He had no practiced reply. The words he might once have used at court, soothing, polite, empty, felt obscene here. "I don't know what I want," he said finally. "Not yet. I know what I don't want." "Which is?" she asked. "To leave you like this," he said. "To walk away and pretend I never found you. To go back to a life that feels like someone else's clothing and wear it until it rots off my body." "That's a lot of not," she said, but there was no mockery in it. "What does your life want, if not that?" He thought of the city, the expectations, the way his name tasted in other people's mouths. He thought of the nights in the thin ring of trees, the way his lungs had opened when he stepped beneath their branches. "I want to choose something," he said slowly, "for myself, not because it's my duty or my role, or what's written in some scroll in the archives. I want to look at a path and say, I will walk this one, and know that if it ends badly, at least it was my feet that took me there." She studied him for a long moment. "And you think choosing me will accomplish that?" she asked. He met her gaze. "I haven't decided whether I'm choosing you," he said, "or whether you're choosing me." Her mouth curved. "Better," she said. In the waking world, his hand still rested on hers. His thumb had found the small hollow between her knuckles, the place where a pulse could be felt. He did not remember moving it there. The skin beneath his touch was warm, alive. In the dream space, there was no bed between them, no dust, no years. Only the strange room, the impossible window, and the electric, humming distance that was and wasn't there. "Can you wake?" he asked. "If I change something, break something, say the right word?" "I don't know," she said. "No one has ever asked me. They assumed I was asleep all the way through, that my will had nothing to do with it." He stepped closer. The air between them tightened, like a string drawn just enough to hold a note. He could see the tiny freckle at the corner of her mouth, the faint unevenness in her bottom lip where she'd once bitten it too hard. "What do you want?" he asked, echoing her earlier question. Her breath hitched, just slightly. "Want is difficult," she said. "It's been so long since I was allowed to admit I had any. The spell quieted my body, but my wanting kept moving. It grew teeth of its own." "Tell me anyway," he murmured. She looked up at him, and in her eyes there was darkness and humor, and a tired, extraordinary kind of bravery. "I want," she said, "to feel something that belongs to this moment, not to a story written before I was born, not to someone else's idea of a princess, something that is mine." He swallowed. His own desires, always carefully folded and tucked away, stirred. "In here?" he asked. "Or out there?" "Both," she said simply. He lifted his hand, the dream hand, reaching toward her face. For a moment, his fingers hovered, centimeters from her cheek. He could feel the warmth coming off her, the way you can feel a fire before you step closer. "May I?" he asked. "Yes," she said, the word a soft exhale. His fingertips met her skin. The contact was a small thing, barely a touch, but it unspooled something in both of them. Her eyes fluttered closed briefly. His pulse stuttered. He felt the fine texture of her skin, the way it yielded and resisted at once. She leaned, very slightly, into his palm. "It's been a long time since anyone asked," she said quietly. "For permission?" he asked. "For anything," she said. In the waking world, his thumb stroked once along the back of her hand. The movement was gentle, almost absent-minded, except there was nothing absent about his mind now. He was hyper-aware of every point of contact, of the way her fingers seemed to warm under his. In the dream, he let his hand fall from her cheek, trailing along her jaw, the curve of her neck. Not possessive, exploratory, reverent. The air between them tightened again. Her breath deepened. "Will you try?" he asked. "To wake?" She opened her eyes. "With you here," she said. "Yes." He nodded. In the tower room, he leaned forward, bringing his other hand to cover hers. He did not kiss her mouth. Instead, he turned her hand slightly and pressed his lips to the inside of her wrist, where the skin was thinnest, where the blood ran close to the surface. The taste of her was warm and faintly metallic. The intimacy of it startled him, the way such a small, precise contact could feel more revealing than any grand gesture. In the dream, she made a sound, small and rough, caught between surprise and something deeper. His mouth there too rested against her wrist. Two worlds overlapped, one echoing the other. The castle shuddered. At first he thought it was his imagination, a trick of the strange double sensory he was experiencing. But then the floor under his feet vibrated, a low, distant groan, as if the foundations were remembering how to move. She staggered, grabbing at his arm. In the bed, her fingers tightened around his. "What's happening?" he asked, in both places at once. "The story," she said, voice tightening. "It doesn't like this." Dust fell from the rafters. Somewhere below, a plate slid from a frozen hand and shattered, the sound echoing up the stairwell like a bell. "Can you stop it?" he asked. "Do you want me to?" She shot back. He thought of his life before. The quiet, polite suffocation. the way he'd walked like a man already half-spelled. He thought of the forest, the wolf, the sharp welcoming of the thorns. He thought of her, standing here in this impossible dream, eyes alive with a ferocity that no curse had managed to entirely blunt. "No," he said. "Then hold on," she replied. He did. The shift was not dramatic in the way bards would later tell it. There were no cracks of thunder, no blinding lights. There was only movement, slow and reluctant, like a body coming back from deep cold. In the castle, lungs began to remember breath. Chests rose a little higher, fingers twitched. Eyes fluttered beneath lids. The dust, which had lain so still for so long, lifted in tiny eddies, disturbed by air that was no longer entirely stagnant. In the tower, her body jerked once on the bed, a small, sharp motion that broke years of perfect stillness. Her fingers clenched around his hand hard enough to hurt. He welcomed the pain. It anchored him. In the dream, she stepped closer, close enough that he could feel the heat of her body against his, the almost touch of her chest to his own. Her hair brushed his shoulder. The space between their mouths was small enough that each of his breaths mingled with hers, a shared rhythm that felt both impossibly intimate and completely right. "Wake up with me," she whispered. It was not a command. It was an invitation. He felt it like a pulse in his own blood. His heart hammered. His body, both the one sitting on the bed and the one standing here, answered in the same way, leaning toward her, drawn by gravity that had nothing to do with the earth. Their mouths met. It was not the chaste, symbolic kiss of the stories, nor was it a reckless consumption. It was slow, exploring, a careful, hungry meeting of two people who had spent too long being told they were something else. Her lips were soft, then firm, moving against his with a deliberate, testing pressure. He answered in kind, letting himself be guided by her, then guiding in return. His hand slid up her back, feeling the warmth through the thin fabric of whatever she wore in this dream space. Her fingers curled in the fabric at his shoulder, pulling him closer. A long, low tremor ran through the castle. Windows rattled in their frames. The briars outside rustled like 1,000 hands. In the bed, her chest rose sharply, sucking in a breath that was not part of the old rhythm. Her eyelids fluttered. A soft, ragged sound escaped her throat, half moan, half sigh. He broke the kiss, not out of reluctance but necessity, pulling back enough to search her face. In the dream, her eyes were wide, pupils blown, lips reddened. Her breath came short. "Again," she said, voice rough. "In there or out here?" he asked, or thought he did. "Yes," she replied and laughed, breathless. He leaned in. Their mouths found each other once more certain this time. The kiss deepened, heat kindling under his skin. There was no rush, no frantic tearing at barriers, only a growing, insistent awareness of each other's presence, of the exact shape of mouths, the subtle tilt of heads that turned the angle just enough to make something inside them both hum. In the tower, her eyes flew open. They were not empty, not glazed. They were bright, focused. They met his with an intensity that made the room, the castle, the world drop away for a moment. He gasped, breaking the physical kiss at her wrist, hand tightening around hers as if to tether them both. "Hello," she said. The word came out rusty, as if her throat had forgotten how to make it, but it carried a smile. "Hello," he answered, voice unsteady. She blinked, long and slow. Tears gathered at the corners of her eyes, more from the shock of air and light than from sorrow. Her fingers flexed in his grip. "I can feel the sheets," she said, sounding halfway between wonder and complaint. I'd forgotten what dust feels like. He laughed, a choked sound that turned quickly into something steadier. They could use washing. We could use washing, she replied, glancing at him with a sideways glimmer. Heat flared low in his belly at the implication. Not crude, not explicit, but undeniably adult. An awareness of bodies, of the potential of closeness beyond hands and mouths and dreams. We have time, he said, for laundry, for whatever comes next. She looked at him, really looked, as if measuring him against something she'd imagined. You came, she said softly, all the way through the thorns. I've been walking toward this for a long time, he said, whether I knew it or not. She shifted, trying to sit up. Muscles that had lain slack for years protested, trembling. He moved instinctively, one hand sliding to her back, the other bracing against the mattress, helping her find the angle. The contact was practical, necessary. It was also charged. Her body was warm against his arm. He could feel the fine tremors of her effort, the heat of her breath against his neck, as she leaned in close for a moment, catching herself. In the dream, they were still standing, still pressed together, the echo of their kisses reverberating through the strange room. The two realities overlapped, layered sensations thickening into something heady. Easy, he murmured. No need to rush. I've been in bed for a century, she said dryly. You'd think I'd be eager to get out of it. Beds have their uses, he said, surprising himself. She arched a brow. Do they? He felt his face heat. For resting, he added, a beat too late. Her laughter loosened something in the air. Resting, she agreed, though her eyes held a spark that suggested she was not limiting the word to sleep. She swung her legs over the side of the bed, bare feet touching the cool floor. For a moment, she simply sat there, breathing, letting her body reacquaint itself with the indignity and wonder of gravity. You're shaking, he said. I'm angry, she replied, and I'm awake, and I've just discovered that my knees have turned to water. He slid an arm around her waist, not quite touching more than necessary, yet acutely aware of every inch where their bodies met. Lean on me, he said. She did. The castle continued its slow, creaking return to itself. Down below, cooks blinked awake to find their pots long spoiled. Guards started and grabbed for weapons that had rusted in their hands. The king and queen, in their chamber, drew simultaneous, bewildered breaths. Rumors would later say that they rejoiced immediately, that they rushed to their daughter's side with tears of pure joy. The truth was more knotted. They were afraid of what had happened, of what their people would say, of what it meant that the story they'd tried to control had slipped beyond their fingers. Up in the tower for a time, none of that mattered. He helped her stand. Her legs wobbled, then held. She took a step, then another, each one a small act of rebellion against the spell that had pinned her down for so long. In the dream, they walked too, through rooms that changed as they moved, through hallways lined with doors that opened onto pieces of her past. He saw glimpses, a child running through a garden, her face alight with something like hunger and joy, a teenage girl standing at a window, hands clenched on the sill, watching riders leave and not being allowed to go with them, a young woman pricking her finger on a spindle, eyes full of something that was not ignorance, but defiance. You weren't careless, he said, as they passed that last door. I was desperate, she replied. They said the spinning rooms were dangerous. They locked them, then they left the keys where I could find them. Some part of them wanted this as much as I did. Sleep? He asked. An excuse, she said. A pause. Time to think. They got more than they bargained for. He thought of the years she had spent wandering the inner landscape of her own mind. of the ways that kind of solitude could sharpen or shatter a person. "What now?" he asked, in both places. She reached for his hand, fingers twining with his. The contact was sure, unhesitating. "Now," she said, "I decide what parts of the story I keep, and what parts I set on fire." He smiled, a slow, fierce curve he had never seen on his own face before. "Will you let me stay?" he asked, "to see which is which?" She looked at him, eyes dark and bright at once. "If you try to write it for me," she said, "I'll have the wolf eat you." "That seems fair," he replied. "If you walk with me," she added, voice dropping, "and remember that I'm not something you found, but someone you met, then yes, stay." In the waking world, their fingers tightened around each other's. He could feel the sweat dampening their palms, the small abrasions from the thorns on his skin, the delicate strength returning to her grip. They stood together at the tower window, looking out over the forest. The thorns still encircled the castle, but they looked different now, less like a cage, more like a boundary drawn by something with a sense of humor and a stubborn streak. Below, people began to move, their voices rising in confused waves. Bells would ring soon, messengers would be sent, feast days would be declared or cancelled, alliances would be reconsidered. Up here, for a while longer, there was only the two of them, and the slow awareness of their own bodies returning. She turned to him, looking him over with frank curiosity. "You're very rumpled," she said. "I fought a hedge," he replied. "You should see the hedge." "I'd rather see you," she said. Heat rose again under his skin, not the sharp flush of embarrassment, but a spreading warmth that made him acutely aware of how close they stood, of the way her nightgown, if that was what it was, clung in soft folds to the lines of her body, of the bare skin at her throat, the hollow there that seemed to invite his mouth. He inhaled slowly. "If I kiss you now," he said, "it won't be for a spell." She stepped closer. The distance between them shrank to a breath. "Good," she said. "I'd like to know what it feels like when it's just us." His hand rose almost of its own accord, cupping her jaw. She leaned into the touch, eyes half-lidded. The kiss, when it came, was different from the ones in the dream, and yet the same. Slower still, deeper, carrying with it the weight of bodies and gravity, and the knowledge that there would be consequences, good and otherwise. She opened to him with a small, eager sound that curled low in his belly. His fingers slid into her hair, mindful of tangles, of the lack of practice. Her hands rested on his chest, then crept upward, fingers splaying over his shoulders, testing the solidity of him. The room seemed to narrow around them, the bed, the dust, the door all fading into a vague periphery. There was only the press of her mouth to his, the warm slide of breath, the careful, unhurried exploration of lips and teeth, and the inches of skin they dared to touch. He did not push, she did not bolt. They moved together in a slow, improvised dance, feeling out the boundaries of this new, shared narrative. There was heat, yes, and a fizzing thread of desire running through it, but it was not the frantic, possessive kind he'd heard men boast about. It was connective, curious, the kind of sensuality that paid attention. When they parted, breathless, her cheeks were flushed, eyes bright. "Well," she said, voice husky, "that answers that question." "What question?" he asked. "Whether I still wanted anything," she replied. He laughed softly. "And?" Her fingers traced idly along his collarbone, the touch light, but full of promise. "And I very much do," she said. "But we may wish to let the castle know we're alive before we scandalize the dust." Is dust easily scandalized? He asked. It's been listening to hypocrites for 100 years, she said. It's developed opinions. He rested his forehead lightly against hers, closing his eyes for a moment. In that brief darkness, he felt the echo of the dream room, the forest beyond the impossible windows, the sense of multiple layers of reality settling into something like alignment. All right, he said. We'll talk to the dust later. Promise, she murmured, and the way she said it turned the simple word into something else entirely. Yes, he said. Later, there would be conversations with parents who did not know how to speak to the adult daughter they'd trapped in a child's story. There would be negotiations with courtiers who wanted to turn this strange waking into a symbol for politics. There would be villagers who brought offerings and questions and fear. There would be nights when she woke shaking, the weight of a century of dreams pressing in. There would be days when he felt torn between the life he'd left and the one he was making. There would be arguments, small resentments, laughter that took them both by surprise. There would also be walks in the forest together, her feet relearning the feel of uneven paths. His hand steady at her back when she stumbled and hers at his wrist when he faltered. There would be evenings on the tower balcony, watching the sun sink beyond the trees, her head on his shoulder, his thumb idly stroking circles on her knee. There would be kisses that grew slower and deeper as they learned each other's languages, touches that asked and answered and asked again. There would be nights when they lay in the big, once lonely bed, not out of spell or duty, but because they chose to, their bodies curved around each other in the easy, sensual closeness of people who had stopped pretending not to want. And sometimes, when he woke in the dark, heart beating too fast from some remnant of his own old life, he would slip softly from the bed and stand at the window, looking out at the forest. If he listened hard enough, he could hear the wolf's distant, sardonic howl, a reminder that the wild still watched, that the story was still being written. He would feel her come up behind him then, her arms wrapping around his waist, her face pressing against his back, warm and real and present. "I'm here," she would murmur, and the words would settle his bones. "You're awake," he would answer. "Most of me," she'd say. "The rest is still wandering, but now I have somewhere to come back to." In time, the tale of Sleeping Beauty shifted. The bards had to adjust their scripts. Some still insisted on the kiss that broke the spell, because it made a neat picture. Others began to sing of the woman who woke herself from a century of being acted upon, who claimed a future that was not written in any cradle curse. They spoke of the man who went into the forest not to win a prize, but to meet an equal. They whispered of the wolf who watched and commented and occasionally scared away those who came for the wrong reasons. They told of a castle that learned to live at the edge of a wild that would not be tamed. But that was later. For now, for this moment, stretched long and quiet in the tower room, filled with dust and the faint new smell of breath, Aurora, no longer only a sleeping beauty, but a waking, wanting woman, stood with the man who had knocked instead of breaking the door, and let herself feel the weight and wonder of being awake. She leaned against him. He wrapped his arms around her, hands spread warm across her back, fingers remembering her shape and promising, without words, that he meant to keep learning it. Below them, the world shifted. Above them, the sky watched, indifferent and full. Between those two great, uncaring things, in a room that had known too much stillness, two hearts beat, a little too fast, perfectly in time. And somewhere just beyond the thorns, in the breathing dark of the forest, the wolf smiled his toothy, untranslatable smile and settled down to listen, knowing that for the first time in a long time, the the story might actually be worth staying awake for.